Okay, so I've realized that if I wait until I hit the next big milestone in my publication process, I might never make another vlog. Or if I do, it might be weeks or months before I get to it. And so I decided to jump backwards in the process and do a quick video, and by quick I mean not at all quick, about my writing process. So I want to start by saying I have ADHD. My writing process is not going to be what a lot of people's writing process it is. Mine is honestly 99.9% about, shoehorning my focus into long-term projects when it does not want to do long-term projects. This is all about me finding a coping mechanism to allow me to do something that is very hard to do with an ADHD brain. But that does mean my writing process is weird, disjointed, doesn't always work for me, but it might provide some tricks and solutions if you're having trouble struggling with your process. I will also say that it's not a step in the process, but I will say I am one of those people, yeah, I gotta write every day. Even if it's not writing on the project I'm working on right now, even if it's writing that I know is going to go in the trash, like literally the second after I finish writing it. It does not matter. I have to write every day. I have to have like an hour set aside for writing every day, or I'm just gonna stagnate, get nothing done. And sometimes, yeah, I fall off that boat and end up spending weeks where I'm doing nothing. But I'm here to talk about my process. We're going to break my process into 6 steps. Inspiration, composing, sketching, writing, editing, and selling. Inspiration. First, how do I get ideas? So I have this really stupid theory that I call output versus input. I firmly believe that to be a creative person, to create anything, you need to have the right amount and the right kind of media coming into your brain. If you're a painter, this is going to mean visual media. You need to be looking at paintings, but also photographs, movies, scenery, anything visual. If you're a musician, you need to be listening to music, or people talking, or the sounds of jackhammers, or whatever it is you're going to be inspired by. And for novelists, that of course means stories. You need to be consuming a lot of stories, and that means books, articles, movies, plays, podcasts, pretty much anything story-based. And for me, at least, it needs to be a wide variety, and it needs to be the right levels. If I'm not getting enough input, I lose all creativity, and I just sit there staring at my blank computer screen with no ability to come up with anything. But on the other side of that, if I get too much input, I go into what I think of as the fan fiction brain. I literally cannot imagine my own characters in my own world because my brain is just hyper-focused on all the media I'm consuming. I end up, instead of imagining my own story, I'm imagining the scenes between the scenes of what movie I just watched. Or I'm imagining what I would say to the characters in this book, or whatever. The important thing is that other people's works start to blot out my own in my brain. So yes, there is a level where I am consuming too much media. But if I get this level exactly right, the exact right balance of input versus output time in my day, then inspiration just sort of comes to me. Like, it is sort of just natural. Like, I'm very rarely sitting down in front of a computer being like, come up with a character, you're going to write a story. That's not how I do it. I'm also not one of those people that like am searching through the internet for writing suggestions or anything like that. That doesn't work for me. What works is natural inspiration. And some of that inspiration will be very one-to-one, very clear where I'm getting things. For example, there's a book that I am very slowly working on, like I am still just in the composing phase of it, that features a kid in foster care. And this was completely inspired by a movie that I watched where a mom and dad adopt 3 kids from foster care. Now, the thing is, the stories have nothing to do with each other except for that one element, foster care. But the important thing is that one kernel, that one germ of inspiration got into my head and bloomed into something much bigger and much more complex. But also, sometimes the inspiration I get is not so one-to-one. Like, sometimes I will be reading a book about a cult of serial killers killing, like, young men, and somehow this will lead to the inspiration of a story about magical beings who represent each season, and it's all very, you know, quiet and calm, and I don't know how that inspiration works in my head. It just happens. So, yeah. I will say, for me, the inspiration stage, a lot of it is just taking what your brain gives you and running with it. But also making sure you're feeding your brain the right stuff so that it will give you something. But then that leads to the next step. Composing. My composing phase can last anywhere between a few hours to years. This is when I basically just daydream and sometimes dream about the events of the story. If I'm driving to work, I'm thinking about what my characters are going to say to each other. I'm going to sleep and imagining fight scenes. Because I'm often thinking of the stories as I'm going to sleep, that means I often literally dream about them. And that means that when I'm waking up, the first thing I'm doing in the bed in the morning when I'm just laying there is trying to work that dream into a more logical story shape. If I'm cooking, I'm having imaginary interviews with my characters. The important thing is that my brain is constantly working on these stories. And sometimes the stories come together very easily, and I'm literally just basically telling myself a bedtime story that will become a book. And sometimes it's literally just once through the book, and yeah, that's the composing phase, I'm good, and I can jump to the next stage immediately. But most of the time, I'm gonna spend years imagining the same scene dozens and dozens of times, perfecting every element of it, changing things up, trying different events, seeing if instead of like going in that door, this character goes in this door and sees what happens there. And I'll keep doing this until I find something that feels right enough to just drive me to pick up a pencil or touch my keyboard. But when I do get there, I jump immediately to sketching. Now, this is what a lot of people would call the outlining step, but I am far too disorganized to feel comfortable with using that word. Outlines imply like bullet points and like the complete shape of the project on one page. And that's not what my outlines are. At least when I start sketching, what I'm going to be getting on the page is a desperate attempt to try to get shit on paper before I forget what I'd imagined. So this happens literally as soon as I've composed something I like, which often is the least convenient time ever. A lot of my sketching happens 2 hours after I was supposed to be asleep, or on a notebook that I keep next to my bedside table as I'm drifting off, and that means I often don't even turn on the lights and I'm just sketching in the dark, trying to read my writing the next morning going, I do not know what this is. I've even sketched an entire scene on top of another scene and was trying to read two texts at the same time. But also, like, on my way to work, I will stop and sketch something down on a piece of paper. Just anything to get it on the page before I ruin my chance of ever remembering what the hell I was imagining. This happens often very quickly. It has to be very simple because I'm just desperate to get words on the page. And it's just enough to remember the sequence of events. I don't use full character names. I write things like R runs to castle, B fights back, K falls, etc. I don't watch my spelling. I abbreviate things that should not be abbreviated. If I'm handwriting, my handwriting gets utterly terrible. Like, this is something that often when I go back to read my sketches, either it's beautiful and perfect, or I have absolutely no idea what it says. I have a couple of projects in my computer folders that I literally do not know what the hell I was trying to say in those sketches, and therefore they are lost for good for me. And that's because this is a race between my desperate need to have something to spark my memory later and my slipping attention span. The one thing that gets more thoroughly sketched out is usually the dialogue, because conversations are one of those things that I find really easy to imagine, but much harder to keep on track when I'm writing them down. So, when I have a dialogue that I really like in my mind, I sketch it immediately, and I write every line of dialogue, though not often the complete line. Like, instead of having a character say, "Hi, James, it's nice to meet you," what will be on the page will be something like, "Hi, nice meet." And that's enough for me to remember what the line actually was, hopefully. Again, I tend to leave off character names. I don't include punctuation. I abbreviate. I'm just trying to get shit on the page before it drifts away. Because this phase is where my ADHD becomes a serious problem. I can start a sentence, and by the end of it, I have jumped ahead to the next paragraph in my mind. And then when I jump back to try to figure out the connective tissue between point A and point B, I completely lose track of anything that happened after that. And it's all just gone. It's disappeared from my mind. I cannot help you with what I was thinking. And this is also something that I need to do immediately. If I decide I don't have time to sketch a scene as soon as it comes to me and decide to, do it when I get home from work, chances are I'm not going to remember any of it when I sit down and try to sketch. And also, because I've lost that scene, I will never be able to write that scene without hating myself the entire time, because I remember that I had something perfect and I didn't write it down. If you ever see me sitting at a computer typing 90 to nothing, not looking up, not moving for hours, it is because I'm sketching. Once I get started, I cannot stop. I have to keep going until I'm at the end of what I've composed, or it's gone. If you interrupt me during this phase, I might cry. This is the only phase of the writing that I cannot have anything playing in the background. If music is on, I turn it off. If TV is on, I turn it off. Because yes, unlike everyone else I've ever met in my life who writes, I tend to write with video playing in the background. But I'll get to that later. But because I sketch things as they come to me, as I'm done with composing them, I often do this out of order. Which often means I start with the climax, then I go into an intro scene, then I sketch a rising action scene, then a bit of exposition, and then a bit of falling action. Across a couple of weeks, I'll be sketching a scene here and there at random moments. And that also means I can almost guarantee there will be some gaping holes once the sketch is done. There will be sections of the book that never get more sketched out than R and L get to know each other, or J learns to fight, or they travel across continent. And those will be the scenes that will be a problem for me later on. But when I think I have enough sketches to see an overall shape of the story, I can finally get to the writing. Okay, so a couple of notes before I jump into explaining my writing phase. Composing, sketching, and writing are steps that I jump back and forth across multiple times for every project on a regular basis. To be completely honest, my timeline usually starts with me composing, sketching, and writing about 20 pages in a week or two, then setting that project aside. I'll spend months or years composing and sketching periodically whenever a project jumps back into my head, which is usually when I'm stuck on a different writing process and just need something to focus on that is elsewise for a minute. But when I finish writing a book and am ready for a new project, I'll spend a couple of weeks just opening up my various started projects, reading through what I have, writing a page or two, realizing the project has not germinated enough, composing and sketching on it a bit, and trying another before I finally find the one that is ready for me to focus on. This is usually the one that has a complete or relatively complete sketch. But that often means that by the time I'm officially done with the sketching phase, I have 50 or more pages already written. I currently have 12 projects that have enough sketched and written out that they will get their own folder on my computer, plus another dozen things that I have some sketching done for. Speaking of which, when I get past the sketching phase on a project, it gets a separate folder on my computer. I usually have a couple of documents holding things like timelines, character descriptions, lists, maps, items characters may be carrying, explanations of government, religions, or any other world-building stuff that I may need to reference back to multiple times throughout the writing process. I will save each draft as a separate document, and the query, synopsis, all that sort of stuff will be in this folder as well, but I also have a document that I just call cut scenes, or scenes cut, where I will copy and paste anything longer than a paragraph or two that is going to be deleted. I learned this as a trick, as a way to make you feel better about cutting something you like but does not belong in the book. But I've kept this habit not because that is important to me. Like, I'm actually perfectly fine with cutting scenes even if I really like them. And I tend to not like the things that don't belong in the book anyway. But I find this more useful because I have a habit of cutting things that didn't need to be cut, and in fact actually needed to be in the book. You see, I tend to write the absolute upper limit of what is considered sellable for the genre, so much of my editing process is just desperately finding anything I can cut. So having that all saved in one place makes it far easier for me to go back and find things that I cut egregiously. But let's get to how I actually write my first draft. I usually take the sketch I've written, highlight it in yellow, put it at the bottom of a new document, and type on the page above it, so that what I have already sketched out is visible on the bottom half of the page as I write. Then I work my way from the beginning to the end, just straight through in chronological order. Usually the sketch I made triggers the memories of what I composed beforehand, and I almost feel like I'm taking dictation from my past self. As I fill in the sketches, I replace that bit of the sketch with the actual writing, but not highlighted, which means that what I'm working on is always at the top of the highlighted section, just below the actual text, which means I know I'm done when all the highlighted text in the document is gone. And now inevitably it does not work this smoothly. Sometimes I get to a section that I thought was so well sketched out, and I was wrong. And I'm trying to compose and write at the same time. Then it becomes a slog, and I often end up having to take a break and just go back to composing for a few days or weeks. Sometimes as I'm filling stuff in, I realize that what I have sketched out is just bad, and I have to go compose something else entirely. Sometimes characters go off on their own, and I end up following them for pages and pages until I realize we are miles away from the sketch. And this often leads to a return to the composing phase. And yes, there are also times that I get to a sketch scene and realize it is just no longer necessary. I admit I still usually end up writing those scenes immediately anyway, and sometimes I literally immediately move it into the cutscenes document. But I find that I still need to write it to see the overall shape of the story. But especially scenes that I have sketched in really thoroughly, it's often so easy to write that it feels less like writing and more like editing. Many conversations, I am literally just filling in Rose said, James said, and the between word actions like he laughed, she pointed at the chair, he flailed about wildly, or whatever. But even though this is a step that I do not find exceptionally hard, it is the phase that I'm going to spend the longest time forcing myself to focus on one thing. This is the phase where the book is most likely to run off track, for me to lose faith in it, or for me to just generally lose steam. It is not rare for me to get about 200 pages in and have to take a break and work on something else for a while. Even if I have not drifted away from the sketch, I sometimes need to return to composing just to revitalize my love for the project. Sometimes all I have to do is just scroll up to the top of the project and read straight down until where I'm at, just to refine the voice. And if I have at any point wandered away from the project, I will once again have to read through the entire thing if I want to move forward at all. Which does have the added benefit of by the time that I have finished the first draft, I have usually read the first 50 pages dozens of times. But this is also one of the many phases of my writing that I do better with a video playing in the background. I usually have a split screen on my computer. One side is streaming something and the other side is a Microsoft Word document. It needs to be the exact right kind of video. It needs to be something that I'm just interested in enough to watch a sentence or two before I stop listening and go back to writing. If I'm too interested, I get distracted and the words from what I'm watching end up in my writing. So I will write sentences like, I Denny's across the park, when I meant to write, I ran across the park. If I'm not interested enough, then I will stop writing and spend hours searching the internet for something I like better. If I have nothing at all playing, I'm really prone to just literally getting up and wander away from the computer because I had a passing thought that I needed to do something in another room. But what works for me is something I have seen at least a couple of times before, but not seen so many times that I can quote it along with the video. And also, weirdly, educational things tend to be perfect for me. I'm not entirely sure why, but if I have something vaguely educational playing, I will be able to just listen to one factoid and then go back to what I'm doing, which might be part of the reason that I know approximately 7 million random disconnected factoids. Like, even as I was writing the script for this, I learned that pig blood was considered the purest of all forms of sacrifice by the ancient Greeks. But that is literally the only bit of that video I watched, and so I have absolutely no idea why she was talking about pig blood in a video about witchcraft. The other thing about my writing phase is I almost never skip around in the story when I'm actually writing. Composing, yeah. Sketching, oh my god, yes, I do nothing but skipping. But when I'm actually at the writing phase, I tend to write each sentence as I go along in the order they will appear in the book. When I'm around a third of the way through the project, that's when I make the decision of this is going to be the next book I finish. And from that point on, I just keep going. I refuse to let myself be sidetracked. If I do pause to work on something else, it is just to write a scene or two, or maybe to sketch something, but I force myself to go back to the book I am working on within 2 weeks. But if I get to that point that I'm literally having to jump to other projects to keep motivated to write, I often end up skipping that scene that derailed me. It is usually one of those scenes that I failed to sketch and had just written something like, D loses faith in M. So I end up leaving that bit highlighted in the text where it is and just jump down past it and continue writing. That way when I'm done with the project, I can just scan through and find that 1 or 2 highlighted bits of text and go, okay, that's something I need to fill in. Though, hilariously, 9 times out of 10, when I do get back to those bits of highlighted text, I realize that the reason I couldn't write the scene is it didn't need to be a scene. It just needed to be an illusion. We just needed the text to say, over the next week, Damien lost faith in Maurice's ability to run a tight ship, and then jump into the next scene immediately. And when I do end up writing a full scene in those spots, that's often a scene I will end up cutting later, because it turns out, if I'm having that much trouble writing a scene, there's a good chance that scene didn't need to be written. The other important thing to know about my first draft is that I am not paying the faintest attention to formatting, and only the slightest attention to word count and the sellability. Thinking about things like that make me really prone to getting trapped in my own head, deciding the book is a waste of time, and stopping the writing process in its tracks. All of those thoughts are for the next step, which is editing. I'll be honest, editing is my favorite stage. I find it very intuitive. You just read through your work over and over again, making changes when things are wrong. But I do have some tricks and a process that I tend to go with. I have never been able to afford a professional editor, so I tend to do a lot of editing stages and constantly revisit them in a desperate attempt to make it look better. Often my editing stages do end up overlapping, but I try to keep them separated because it allows me to focus more on what I'm doing. The first edit is the slowest edit. This is the one that I'm looking at line editing. I'm focusing on word choice, sentence structure, grammar, and continuity. I make sure I spell characters' names the same throughout the book. I track how much money characters have. I make sure that I'm writing readable, correct, coherent English. I cut unnecessary adjectives. And as I edit, to track where I am, because this edit often involves scrolling up and down the text a lot to find that little continuity error, I format as I go. So usually I write in like Times New Roman 12-point font, single space, and not indenting paragraphs. I don't take time for any of that. But when I'm done editing a paragraph in the first draft, in the first edit, I double space it. I give it an indent. That way, when I scroll up to, say, make sure I've said the correct number of days have passed, or whatever, I can scroll back down until everything looks all squashy. And that's when I know I'm back at the unedited sections. Now this edit, I am not really looking for scenes to be cut or added. I'm not looking at big changes in the plot, but I will find them. Sometimes I just mark them by highlighting as an indication to come back to this later. Sometimes I sit there and fully rewrite scenes during this edit. When the brain juices is working, I let them work. Then, once I'm done with the first edit, once I've read through the entire thing, I take a break. I work on something else. I spend a few months focusing on selling a previous project or composing and sketching something new. I try my hands at working on the project that I've written about 10 pages on between every single book I've written. Like at this point, this book is never getting written. I just write 10 pages every 2 years. I generally take my mind elsewhere so that when I get back to this project, I'm looking at it with fresh eyes. I want to be as close to a new reader as I can make myself. Now, when I do get back to the second edit, I try to just read through as quickly as possible to keep my mind on the shape of the project. This is when I really start to see scenes I can cut, bits that are missing, and if the whole climbing action, climax, falling action work at all. Just like with the previous edit, there will be bits where I wander away from what I'm supposed to be doing. I will sometimes stumble across a sentence that just doesn't work, and before I know it, I'm line editing page after page after page. Also, because I will inevitably have rewritten scenes during that last round of editing, I usually do allow myself to take the extra time to line edit those scenes that have been changed, because this is their first edit. But otherwise, when I find myself line editing, I pull myself out. I force myself to read forward. I literally just say, no, you cannot change any one-word changes. Sometimes the only way I can manage to do this with myself is to highlight the sections that sound rough with the intention of coming back to them later. But the important thing is that you keep moving, so that you are getting the shape of the novel. If the last edit was the equivalent of standing in front of a painting with a magnifying glass looking at the individual brush strokes, this is the equivalent of stepping back to the far side of the room so you can see the composition and balance. It's important to get both views to have an idea of if a book is working. Then I take another break. Usually the second break is not nearly as long, and usually I focus on composing and sketching during this time. Because frankly, I've been hyper-focused on one project too long for me to be able to let it go for long. The third edit I like to do on paper. Why? Because for some reason, changing how I'm looking at my work completely changes how I see it. I will read the same line on a computer dozens of times and think it's fine. And then I see it on the page and realize it is the clunkiest thing ever written. Weirdly, I do also find that this edit tends to work really well for me to see the big picture. This is the one where I'm likely to notice scenes that can be completely cut, though primarily I am generally looking more at line editing for this one. But the second half of that third edit is getting to copy my changes from the paper document into the computer one. And that actually gives me one more chance to look over the changes I'm making to see if they make sense and if they actually improve the book, or if I just got way too excited with the pen and started striking through everything. Then I have a fourth edit that I don't often end up creating a separate document for, because it is never a planned edit. I never intend to do this one. I always end up pulling up the document intending to move on to the next step, but I get distracted and start just rereading it. And reading it leads to making changes, and usually I'm about 100 pages in before I realize that I am in another edit and should have made a separate document for it. And then we have what is originally another accidental edit. A few years ago, I started recording what is basically an audiobook version of my books for my mom to listen to, and I noticed that even though I am prone to reading my works aloud as I edit, which is something I encourage you to do, the process of doing so at full volume and playing it back as I edited the audio track was significantly more useful than just reading it to myself. I found a lot of problems that I had not seen before. I noticed that I am really prone to overusing character names. My characters sigh more than any human being ever should. I realized that some of my sentences could be read with completely different tone than I had intended them to be. So I started making changes as I did that process of recording the audiobook. And I strongly suggest you do something similar. Don't just read your work aloud. Record yourself reading it and play it back to yourself. Yes, your voice will be annoying. Ignore it and keep doing it. You will find so many things that need changed. Most of these corrections will be line edits, but yes, I did find bigger picture things with this as well. My favorite was one I noticed that I had written a flashback in a flashback in a flashback, which made perfect sense to me when I was writing it and in all 4 other edits, but while I was reading it aloud and then playing that audio recording to myself, I kept getting lost in what time I actually was in and realized that scene needed to be rewritten so everything happened chronologically. And after that is when I'm officially done. But I'll be honest, I'm never done. I am someone who does reread my own work. I love my characters and I enjoy spending time with them. So yeah, sometimes when I'm struggling to write, thinking about sequels, or even if I'm just depressed, I open my older books and start reading the documents. And I don't think I have ever done this without making changes here and there. The one good thing about having never been published is I can keep making changes. Now, usually by this point I'm not looking at big changes, but that's because I'm not trying to sell those books right now. There are things that I have noticed will need to be changed if I ever get any interest in them. For example, I know that Arya's dragon doesn't have a solid conclusion right now, like the falling action just sort of stops. So yeah, if I get an agent and she shows interest in representing some of my older works, or if I jump into the self-publishing camp and decide to publish Arya's dragon on Amazon, I will need to fix that last chapter. But I've sort of moved on for now, so I'm not considering myself still editing that work right now. Also, there's the side of if I get feedback from pretty much anyone, I'm going to end up doing a full reread/edit. So like, I currently have a book out with some beta readers. I've been through all 4 official steps of my editing process with this already, but if someone does get back to me and says that, for example, there are too many times the themes almost get caught and get away, I will go look at all those scenes, decide which one can be cut it, tidy up the text around it, then read the entire book again to make sure it makes sense with what I have changed. Even if I decide that none of them can be cut and decide to disregard the feedback I was given, I will be reading the entire book again to make sure I agree with my own decision. But at that point, I consider myself ready to move on to the next step, which is selling! This is the query, synopsis, pitch, bio, comps, and all that jazz. Which, if you're interested in how I do that, check out my other videos on the querying process. I will link them at the end of this video. I'm not going to run through all that in this video again. So yeah, that is my writing process. I know it won't work for everyone. Hell, I doubt it would work even for most people with my very specific mix of OCD and ADHD. But maybe there are things in here that 1 or 2 of you might find useful. Or you can gloat in the comments that your writing process is so much more coherent than mine. No matter what, I hope you enjoyed this run-through of my writing process and maybe inspired you to be interested in what I write. Either way, thanks for watching.